So is Russia going to have to go all the way to Kiev to get them to submit? Is that, I mean, in their calculation?
Well, I think that the probability of that being the case is growing with each passing day.
Mm-hmm.
Again, the Russians don't want to rule Ukrainians. Putin has said this several times. He's not interested in, quote unquote, conquering Ukraine, never was. All he wanted was neutrality for Ukraine. And what we did is we rejected neutrality in favor of this so-called NATO membership, but we had already spent 8 years from 2014 until 2022 building up this huge Ukrainian army, equipping it, training it, staffing it with the best officers and non-commissioned officers that we could find, and then preparing to launch it against the Russians. I think if the Russians had not attacked it, probably by the summer of 2022, you would probably have seen limited Ukrainian offensives against Russians in eastern Ukraine. Remember, all of this is about the fact that the Russian people in eastern Ukraine, and that's almost a third of the Ukrainian population that speak Russian, are culturally Russian, ethnically Russian, they were oppressed. They were treated as third-class citizens inside Ukraine. They were forced to either, quote-unquote, Ukrainianize or leave the country. So the Minsk agreements were designed to address this, but as we found out from Merkel and Macron in Europe, those agreements were a fraud. They were never serious. They were simply designed to buy time for the expansion and growth of Ukrainian military power. So now most of that military power is being destroyed. You have very few people with any experience that have survived combat and are capable left. That's why the return of these 30 to 35,000 from overseas is so important. So this is sort of the last gasp that I think the Ukrainians can manage on the ground. The Russians will dispatch it. And again, I think the Russians have figured out we're going to have to go to the river, to the Dnieper. We're going to have to turn south, take Odessa, turn north, take Kharkov. Those are the things that they were interested in to begin with because that's where the Russians live. They don't really want to cross the river and try to manage or rule Western Ukraine. I mean, the Russians aren't stupid. They know that the Ukrainians don't want to be ruled from Moscow. But they feel compelled at this point to continue further simply because we've made it clear that whatever remains of Ukraine, we will transform into some sort of battering ram to be used against Russia. Russia's not going to accept that. The analogy would be if we discovered that the Chinese or the Russians or someone else was trying to transform Mexico into a platform for attack against the United States. Now, some people would say that's already happened with the drug cartels. That's another subject, and I agree that something we should be much more concerned about that than what's happening in Ukraine. But the point is, we would not tolerate foreign forces on the ground in Mexico building up an anti-American force. We would destroy it. Well, that's essentially what the Russians have done in Ukraine. But we don't want to rule Mexicans either. We want the Mexicans to govern themselves. And the Russians want the Ukrainians to govern themselves, but they want neutrality for whatever remains of Ukraine. And that condition is not going to change.
So how spent is Russia in terms of how many soldiers do they have? How many have they lost? How many are in the best quality to continue this type of war? Their economic and weapons situation, where are they at? How spent are they in this whole?
Well, their economy is booming. They're doing land office business. Their exports, particularly of minerals and petroleum products, is at an all-time high. There is a meeting that will occur later this month in St. Petersburg involving 84 countries. And all of these countries are interested in what Russia and China are billing as gold-backed currency. All of these countries want to get out from under the U.S.-dominated financial system in the West. And the only way to do that is to go to, first and foremost, gold-backed currency trading. Now, the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, obviously the Saudis and many of the Emirates have stockpiled an enormous quantity of gold. So they're ready to move in this direction. This would cut us out of the loop and essentially remove the burden of dealing with us through our system. This also means that they stop trading in dollars, which means we can't pass on our debt to them anymore, which is effectively what happens when they do business with us in dollars. those 84 countries plus Russia, India, China, I think they have a very good chance of bringing this off. So that's the first thing. The point is that economically, we have not hurt Russia at all. Russia has boomed. Secondly, militarily, their factories are operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to produce military equipment of all types and kinds, everything from cruise missiles, tactical ballistic missiles, all the way to tanks and aircraft and rifles. So there is no shortage of equipment. Lastly, manpower. Well, they right now have about 800,000+ in the Russian army, and that number continues to grow. There are certainly 700,000 either involved in the Ukrainian operation or serving in Russia in support of it. There are probably 300,000 to 400,000 Russian combat troops between Belarusia, up north, White Russia, and southern Ukraine ready to strike as needed. So they're in a very good position. But as I said at the beginning of this discussion, one of the things that is now being discussed behind the scenes in Moscow is the potential for total mobilization. If they go to a full mobilization force, then you're talking about 2 million men in the Russian army.
All coming into Ukraine, or not all coming in, right?
Well, this all depends on us. I mean, they don't want to do these things, but if we are going to stand fast on our insistence that whatever remains of Ukraine has to be part of NATO, has to be hostile to Russia, has to host foreign forces, has to potentially host missile systems that we would put on the ground that threaten Russia, which was always on the agenda. As long as we insist upon that, the chances of the Russians going to full-blown mobilization are quite real. And that means that they'll move all the way to the Polish border, as well as to the Romanian border and the Moldovan border, once and for all. They just don't want a repetition of what they've just been through in Ukraine again. I mean, that's understandable. They don't want to go through this. But we, again, have refused to consider any alternative to what I just described. And it's unfortunate, David, because, neutrality could have been an enormous bonanza for Ukraine. Neutrality is what Austria has enjoyed for decades. Austria's standard of living before it became neutral was far below Germany. Today, the standard of living in Austria is actually above Germany. In other words, Austria has profited economically enormously from neutrality. And I think Ukraine could have done that as well, and been a bridge of prosperity between East and West.
So who's calling the shots over there to keep it going? Zelensky, its government, his patrons, or United States, CIA? Is there different factions fighting over how to deal with this, or is it
all of the above? All of the above. Zelensky has always been sponsored by key figures in Washington, London, New York City.
So was it always a lie, basically, when he came into power on a position of trying to normalize relations with Russia? Was it always?
I think that's pretty clear, yeah. And the thing that people should remember...
Reminds me of George W. Bush running as a humble foreign policy and turning into a warmonger.
No, that's right. I remember that Bush sitting across from McCain during the primary season. Everybody agreed that our intervention in Kosovo and Bosnia had been a mistake. How many R's are there in that chant, right?
It's always the guy that runs as the anti-war guy that turns into the big belligerent John Bolton fan.
Yeah, well, I think Zelensky was always not who he appeared to be. Remember, Zelensky, strictly speaking, never spoke any Ukrainian. He only spoke Russian. That was his first language. And
how did their government have the audacity? If he only spoke Russian, but yet they were criminalizing people for saying good morning in Russian in the eastern side, how did they do that? How did they square that one?
Well, this is part of the reason he had so much support, though, because most people in Ukraine simply did not want Ukraine to be hostile to Russia. They didn't want a war. Mm-hmm. And he essentially said, if you elect me, I'll find a way forward. I'll negotiate peace with Putin. Now, it took him about 3 months to get to the point where he was fluent in Ukrainian and spoke it, largely accent-free, although I'm told by many Russian and Ukrainian speakers that he continues to speak Ukrainian with a Russian accent. I don't know. The bottom line is, at this point, it's academic. Is he really interested in Ukraine? I find it hard to believe. I mean, he's sitting there with Larry Fink from BlackRock, And BlackRock is keenly interested in stripping all the resources it can from Ukraine and Russia, buying up all the property in Ukraine, ostensibly for future use by him and his co-investors. And this is something that Zelensky is willing to do. Doesn't sound like a Ukrainian nationalist to me. So I think.
But aren't the Ukrainian nationalists? Aren't there Ukrainian nationalists that are best fighters? What would be their morale in continually fighting for BlackRock at this point? I don't understand. If there's, I'm just trying to think strategically. If they're all into this, and they're saying, "Wait a second, we're doing this for BlackRock," I thought we were all nationalistic or something.
Well, remember, David, that one of the advantages that the people spitting out the narrative of evil Russians who are committing atrocities and all this sort of business had the advantage of the Cold War behind us. I mean, for decades, people saw anybody who spoke Russian as potentially dangerous and certainly, if not evil, then certainly criminal in some way. Well, the Cold War ended, but this sort of picture of Russia lingered into the present. Mm-hmm. Now, today's Russia is not perfect. No society is, but it is certainly nothing at all like the Soviet Union. It is a Russian Orthodox Christian country. It is nationally based around Russian national identity, culture, and language. I think those are some of the reasons why the Western, what I call the oligarchs in the West, are so interested in destroying it. But the real underlying purpose is if they can bring down Russia, its government, if they can replace, say, Putin with someone like Zelensky, then ultimately you can gain access to all the resources that Russia has to offer. And Russia's resources are in abundance, and they would love to have access to that. So I think that's a legitimate concern for the Russians, and I think we need to understand that that's behind their thinking. Now, if you're a Ukrainian, you're also a victim of your experience with the Soviet Union. Remember that you had somewhere between 6 and 9 million Ukrainians that were systematically starved, murdered, or transported to their deaths in the Gulag between 1929 and 1932 under Stalin. And the memory of the NKVD officers who came in there and did those things to the population has deep roots. So you're evoking these memories by appealing to Ukrainians to fight against the Russians, even though today's Russians bear no resemblance to the force that was communist and Soviet back in the 1930s. We even see these old descriptions lifted from histories of the Soviet armed forces during World War II that talk about the nature of the Soviet soldier, and they just strip out all the old language and they put in Russian soldier in the modern era, attributing the same attributes and the same behavior patterns to them that were there in 1933 to say 1945. It's not true, but again, how do you fight this underlying predisposition for people to believe the worst about your chosen enemy? It's very difficult to fight that. And I think that's worked to the advantage of the regime in Kiev. Now, having said that,